Yeah, nice to see everyone here today. My name is Shabir Laka. I'm the editor of Counterfire, and I'm going to be chairing the discussion today. Holly Rigby was supposed to be chairing, but unfortunately she's not feeling well, so I'm taking her place. I hope everyone's managing to keep cool in these crazy temperatures. But on the plus side, it means you're here with us, so that's good. Today we're joined by two leading figures on the left to discuss kind of what we're all thinking about the multiple crises that we're facing and the absolute kind of chaos that we're witnessing. So I'm pleased to say that we're joined by James Schneider, who is the former head of Jeremy Corbyn's communications and is currently head of communications with Progressive International, and is the author of the upcoming book, Our Bloc, How We Win, which I'm sure we can mention in the discussion, and I can put a link in the chat for where people can buy it when it comes out. And also Lindsey German, who is the convener of the Stop the War Coalition, has been active in movements for a very long time and has written a number of books, including Material Girls, Men, Women and Work, and Class, Wealth and Power in Neoliberal Britain. So both of the speakers will speak for about 5 minutes, just give a little introduction, and then I have a couple of questions, and then we can open it up to the floor for discussion. So without further ado, if we can start with James, if that's okay, if you're okay to start, over to you.
Thanks very much, Shabir, and thank you everybody for joining on this hot evening. And so we're talking about system failure, but I think it's more than system failure. We've got system breakdown, and that's what we're starting to live through. We have the luck of being some of the generations to live through this. And what we're seeing today is sound muted for everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me? All right. What we're seeing today is just it's just a taster. It's just a sort of tip of the iceberg. 40 degrees heat, houses on fire, trains not working, roads melting, planes grounded because the railways, the runways are melted. These are all signs of a deeper systemic breakdown, which we've had many signs of since the 2008 financial crisis. And that heralded the end of the sort of previous model of running the globe with neoliberalism. And the ruling class really can't find, and has failed to find in any country, a sustainable replacement system to that. And that's because they're really running up against hard barriers. The whole system is running up against really hard barriers. So that's not just climate breakdown, although that is massively significant. We've almost gone past the point where there will definitely be big changes to our environments, bad changes to our environments from the amount of CO2 we put into the atmosphere. The Met Office a few years ago, I think 4 years ago, did a weather map for July in the UK in 2050 based on what projections were. And it looks basically the same as the weather map for today. And it has looked the same as the weather map has done for the last few days. So that's 28 years in advance. We are racing ahead of even the worst projections on that. Of course, we've got it's not just in the climate though. All of these different parts of the system, they all relate to the same thing. We have an economic system which is based on the continued extraction of very cheap energy. And even without climate change, at some point in the coming decades, we would begin to come to an end of the fossil fuels that we can drag out, but we have to transition beyond that. And we can, the debt that's built up, both corporate and national debt, is built up on the basis that the system can carry on expanding in the same way it has, and it can't. And even small little shocks we can see, the system is too fragile to deal with. So the supply chains don't work with a few, a few backups because of COVID, because of some staff shortages, and things fall down. Or you look at the food system, the global food system run by 4 global monopolies, the ABCDs of hunger. and heavily speculated upon in the exchanges in Chicago, you get one shock to the system with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and hundreds of millions of more people on Earth don't have enough to eat. And this is also why we have terrible political volatility. You see, I mean, political volatility can be a good or a bad thing, but it's definitely happening. And then we see it here at home. It's the impact on everyone, because everything is going up. We all know this, everything is going up. It's not just the mercury in our thermometers that's going up. You know, the cost of your weekly shop, bills, rent, debt repayments, mortgages, everything's going up. The wealth of billionaires is going up. Corporate profits are going up. The only thing that's not going up is pay. And I think these things are so obvious to people. It's so immediate to people. It's so material to people that we're already starting to see and are going to see a really big fight back. And that's what we're going to, I think, have this autumn. We're going to have an autumn of action where the three traditional tactics that people have used to fight power are going to be, they're going to be out in force, and they're going to hopefully be united. So those are strikes, people withdrawing their labor. We already saw, you know, with the railway workers, with their union, the RMT, and the barristers, but there's going to be much, much more. There are many ballots going out. There's the BT Open World workers with their union, the CWU. And there are going to be strikes, and there's going to be solidarity with those strikes, I think, like we haven't seen beforehand, not just in popular support, but people going down to pickets and people doing non-strike related secondary actions in support of, in support of strikes, not follow-up strikes. Then there's people can't pay. People can't pay for things. Just saw a report today about rents going up 20%. I mean, how people are already overstretched. Tenants already pay their landlords over £50 billion a year in rent. They simply can't pay anymore. You've already got 1 million people who are unable to pay their energy bills, and that's before they go up to over £3,000 a year. So people are going to just not pay. They're either going to not pay because they can't pay, or they're going to not pay as part of campaigns in solidarity with each other. And we're also going to see occupations, primarily against the climate crisis, but also against other things, I imagine, where fossil fuel sites, the offices of oil companies, the banks that support them, major places like Westminster and other bits of infrastructure are probably going to be blockaded and occupied, and people sitting down and saying, no, the political system has to do something about this. And so with the question, what can socialists do? And this is the bit where I shamelessly plug my book that I've written that comes out in September. Please, share it on, buy it or share it on social media, or smile at it once so I get some good karma. Which is called Our Bloc, How We Win. And in it, I argue that rather than arguing about whether the Labour Party is or isn't a potential vehicle for change, the thing that we should do, because we need to strengthen our forces, is to bring together as much of progressive movements, trade unions, the grassroots left, the campaign groups, with the elected left-wing politicians around the country into a left bloc, so that we can raise up the socialist voice and socialist arguments on issue after issue, where for 2 years we've been chased out of popular debate. But we can also act as movements. We don't have the bully pulpit of the leader of the opposition's office, so we can't just walk on the news, but we can make news with protest, with action, with spectacle. And the more it's coordinated and the more that it's joined up, we can build our power, and then we can begin to look forward to creating the sort of vehicle that we need that can then take on the state, enter the state, and with sufficiently powerful social forces, with stronger, more militant trade unions, with stronger and more powerful social movements that are well organized, and with all of us standing up and taking action, then I think we have a chance, not of saving the system. We don't want to save the system. And to be honest, the system isn't really savable. We can't go on the way it was, but tweet, a bit nicer, or maybe even a lot nicer. The hard barriers are really there. So to transform the system, and to not just win the war, not just have a world to win, but also, a planet, and not to be too grand, but I mean, actually a civilization and a species to say. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, James. Over to you, Lindsey.
Okay, thanks very much, Shabir, and thanks, James. I want to really agree with so much of what James has said in terms of the state of the world in which we live, and what a disastrous state it is, whether you talk about climate change, whether you talk about the levels of inequality, whether you talk about the poverty in even the richest countries in the world, let alone in the global south, whether you talk about any of those things, but also in terms of what is happening in Britain, where the figures announced in the last day or so show that something that most of us already were quite aware of, I think, but have been backed up by it, which is that the incomes of workers have fallen, and fallen quite dramatically over recent decades, and that they've also fallen in relation to competitor countries such as France and Germany. So you've got a situation where people are paying record amounts of rent, where they're having to pay ever more for food, they're having to pay huge amounts for petrol, and people still very much rely on petrol because we have a public transport system which is both inadequate and incredibly expensive. So it simply isn't an alternative for a lot of people at the moment. You've got all these big things going on, and I think we all, I think for all of us, we look at it, and I mean, I found today particularly, it makes you feel particularly kind of sober about these things, because not just with the very obvious evidence of global warming, again, not just in this country, but in large parts of Europe and in North America and North Africa, you've got lots of forest fires and all those things going on. You've also got fires going on across London. I mean, quite incredible as a result of the heat wave and the destruction that those are already causing. But I also, I think, want to just kind of touch on in these kind of introductory remarks on the political situation that we also find ourselves in, because we're also in the throes of a Tory leadership contest, which is I mean, if anything's perhaps more dispiriting than the state of the world overall, or just as dispiriting, at least in the kind of microcosm, is the caliber and the quality and the sheer idiocy of the candidates for the Tory leadership. And it seems to me that none of them have had remotely any sense, not just of climate change, which most of them seem to think isn't really a big problem, and that it's just a bit like 1976 with, a few degrees higher, and let's not worry about it. And as Dominic Raab said, people should enjoy the sunshine, and all these other completely inappropriate ways of dealing with it. But also, if you look at the whole question of the cost of living crisis, how working class people actually live, and it's clear, not surprisingly from these people who are extremely rich Tories, they have absolutely no idea how people live, and they have no idea what to do about any of the major problems facing British capital. And the reason I raise this is because we've come through, and obviously James has been very directly involved in this process, but we come through the whole Corbyn experience, if you like. We came through a situation where in 2015 people were very, very infused and galvanized by the possibility of a left-wing leader of Labour. We had the election in 2017 where Jeremy did far, far better than anybody expected him to do. But of course, we've also seen since 2019, and I think this will be, in a way, how history looks at it. We've also seen the big defeat of Corbynism, the way in which Starmer and those around him tried to eradicate all the elements of the left. And if you think about it, there's that process of Corbynism. There's also the process of Bennism in the early 80s, where in both cases, where you had people who were very, very serious socialists, very, very committed, not to the overthrow of the whole system, but to basic fundamental change to the way in which society works. And in both cases, attacked and vilified, destroyed from within the Labour Party and from outside, in a way which is really, when you look at the detail of it, really quite remarkable. And I think it's worth, when we're talking about what the left does now, I think the first thing that we have to do is to try to get over that defeat, because I think that for us, we can't just look back at, and I think this is why James's book, which says it's not a question whether you're in Labour or not in Labour, I think is a very important point, because, you know, this isn't just a question of should we stay and fight, should we be outside Labour, should we set up a new party, all these sorts of things, which we all have. I have my own opinions on, and we all have our own opinions on, and maybe we'll have some discussion about this. But it's really a question of how socialists organise and what we try to do. And I think I just want to say a couple of things about this. The first is that if you think about socialism, socialism's got a history of around, I suppose, 200 years, a bit more than 200 years, I suppose, but going back to, you know, just after the French Revolution and so on. And the first socialists who were important then were, of course, the utopian socialists, who really had the view that if you could only have people who had better ideas and who could do things in a more progressive way, then you would achieve a lot of what you wanted to do. You know, this is true of Robert Owen and Saint-Simon and Fourier and all these sorts of people. And those were very important ideas at the beginning, at the early years, the early decades of capitalism. But of course, the problem with the utopians, and I think it's something we need to talk about today as well, is that socialism isn't, essentially, it's not just a moral question. I mean, there's lots of important moral issues that socialists should have things to say about and do have things to say about. But it's also, and I think this is where Marx made the big advance on the utopian socialists, is also a question of how we can change things and who has the power to change things. And of course, what Marx, the conclusion he drew was that the working class has the power to change society because it's an exploited class, and it controls it. It doesn't control the means of production, but it actually produces the wealth in society. Now, when you look at the strikes today, I think it's very, very important, because the strikes of the rail workers, I think, have been, for many socialists, the most exciting thing that's happened since the demise of Corbynism. And, you know, everybody is saying, isn't Mick Lynch wonderful, as though people have never heard a working class person making an articulate, you know, case for their strikes, which of course many trade unionists, of course, are more than capable of doing. But I think as well, they've galvanized people, because people suddenly see in very, very concrete terms that there is an alternative power in society. It's one that you don't see very often, but it is, you know, when they say the trains aren't going to run, the trains don't run. Today, the postal workers have balloted, the result of their ballot, overwhelming, very high turnout, and overwhelming, what was it, 96 or 97% voting to go on strike. Now, these are, you know, this suddenly brings home to people who run society, who does the work in society, in a way that the pandemic also brought out some of these features. Who were the people who were really important? So I think those are crucial things for us to look at in terms of the strikes. As James says, the other political activity, the occupations, the other things that people do, the whole series of campaigns that people do on a range of issues. And I think that, you know, we have to look at, we're entering into a period of great calamity and catastrophe, but also in a way of great hope, because if you look at it, you know, people always say, why is it that people put up with stuff for years and years? Why is it they put up with 0 hours contracts? Why do they put up with union busting? Why do they put up with greedy landlords and all the other things that we do put up with most of the time? And, you know, suddenly there's a point at which people don't put up with these things anymore. And I think we're reaching a point where people don't put up with these things in the way they do. Rosa Luxemburg described it in the 1905 revolution in Russia. She described it, it's like the working class getting an electric shock, that suddenly they're kind of, you know, we don't have to do this anymore. And I think we're definitely moving towards that kind of thing. Now, that puts a great it gives us great hope, but it also puts a duty on socialists. And I think one of the problems we have is the left is very fragmented. The arguments about internal arguments about Labour, internal arguments about what people have done in the past can dominate the kind of politics we have. And I think it's very, very important that we don't allow that to happen. So in terms of what we do, I would say, firstly, solidarity with the strikes and all the other struggles that people are engaging in over a whole range of issues that are taking place, but also building organizations which are about bringing together people from different traditions and different organizations over specific things, whether it's strike solidarity, whether it's climate change, whether it's any of those sorts of things. But also for me as a socialist, I've been a revolutionary socialist for a long, long time now. And therefore people who know me will know that I'm in favor in general of revolution. And I think it's a good idea. And I think we should have an international revolution would be a huge step forward. In fact, to me, it's the only way of overthrowing capitalism and creating real system change. But for most of my time as a revolutionary socialist, it wasn't absolutely obvious to people that things in Britain and in other countries didn't work, that the system can't stop the glaciers from melting, that they can't provide a decent income for working people. They can't do any of these very, very fundamental things. I think today we're looking at a world where you have to say the system doesn't work, and it isn't going to be. Even the very, important, but at the same time, limited reforms that Jeremy tried to bring in were treated as though, it is simply not acceptable. Left reformist politics has been knocked out of the park for the time being in British politics, in terms of Parliament, in terms of the Labour Party, in terms of those kind of things. So I think we're also looking at the question of how do we achieve that systematic overthrow? And I would argue that also does lie in a revolutionary transformation. So I'll end it there.
Thank you very much, Lindsey. Those are both great introductions, which have kind of covered the questions I was going to ask. So I might just move directly to the floor. But yeah, but just to say that I think it's a really good starting point to this discussion in terms of the multifaceted crises that we face and how they intersect and what that does mean for socialists in terms of how we organize. And just to say, because you mentioned about the strikes, that congratulations to the CWU for their fantastic ballot today, which is the biggest strike mandate since the 2016 Trade Union Act was brought in. So that's fantastic. And just in case people didn't have the dates, the RMT and TSSA are striking on the 27th of July, ASLEF on the 30th of July, and the CWBT Openreach workers are striking on the 29th of July and the 1st of August. So it'll be good to get out on the picket lines as much as you can. I think it will be important to build that solidarity. So I think there was a lot of questions kind of that come up in what you were saying in terms of kind of overcoming the left fragmentation, in terms of the role of the Labour Party, of revolutionary organizations, of protests and different tactics. So I'm sure people have lots of things to ask, and hopefully we can flesh out some of those things and probably get us a bit of a sneak peek of James's book in the process as well. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand using on Zoom, which is under reactions, and then I'll call on you. So I'll go to Ellie Badcock.
Thanks. Sorry, I haven't got my camera on. I don't know how you're all wearing t-shirts, but it's way too hot. No one needs to see that. So, but I guess I just I was thinking when Lindsey said about like people not being willing to kind of take all of this anymore, and people kind of starting to just get that electric shock. And literally, like just as Lindsey was speaking, I got this email through from Unison saying the government have offered 5% to NHS staff, and we recommend that you don't accept it, which is unbelievable because this time last year, Unison was saying, listen, 15% is way too much to ask for, like, we need to be more realistic about this and blah blah, like, and weren't asking for that much. And then in a year they've gone from not even asking for 5% to saying, oh, that's not good enough, we want more, which, yeah, I don't know, can get kind of quite depressing sometimes, I suppose, if you're dealing with this kind of quite big and bureaucratic trade union that always seems to be moving a bit slowly, and for even them to be kind of standing up and saying like, no, this isn't good enough. Yeah, no, I just thought it was kind of fantastic. I guess I don't really have anything more to say, but I was very excited about it, so I just wanted to go woo. And yeah, it's yeah, I think the tone in this meeting is really great and kind of inspiring, really, in what feels quite apocalyptic right at the moment, like with all these fires and like, the world literally collapsing. It's nice to have those moments of like, oh yeah, we can do something about this. So cheers. That was a bit of a ramble, really, not a question, but thanks.
Thanks very much, Ellie. I saw a hand from Gail Hawkes, which seems to have gone down. Do you still want to say something, Gail? Ask you to unmute if you do.
Hi, sorry, no, it was on by mistake.
Ah, okay, no worries. Faizi.
Yeah, sorry, I need to leave my camera off as well. Sorry about that. But I just wanted to thanks to James and Lindsey for very insightful comments. I just wanted to point to, and similarly to Ellie, point to the idea that we have to kind of have a very sober analysis of what is going on in the world. And I was reading an article, I think it was by Bill McGuire in The Guardian today. And, he was talking about how, the 40-degree weather is basically, something that we're going to be we're going to see in a few years as a cool year compared to what's coming. But it was all, and it is very brutal. And I think we need to look at the truth of it, particularly in terms of the climate crisis, but all the other crises as well. And but at the same time, we also need to always talk about what needs to be done. And it's always because there's always something that we can do, no matter how bad things get. There's always something that we can do. There's always something that we can organize and intervene and so on. And I mean, within our trade unions, within our organizations and so on. And he didn't mention anything. And so you have this very long article with this kind of brutal description of what it's going to be like for our children and so on. And yet no mention of, well, in the end, it was the last paragraph about, what you can do as an individual. And I think that's, ultimately the wrong way to position this. Yes, we can do things as individuals, but that is not where the ultimate solutions lie. The ultimate solutions lie in collective agency, in working class power, and as Lindsey said, in revolution. I mean, the situation is so radical that we need to respond in a very radical way. And all of a sudden, the idea of revolution isn't utopian or unrealistic or any of those things. It's actually what is precisely needed. And of course, the revolution is not going to happen tomorrow, but it we can kind of start that process and basically see where it leads. But it requires a collective response.
Thank you, Faizi. Lawrence.
Hi, I'll leave my profile picture on because it's a profile picture of Castro and Malcolm X. In 1960, when Castro visited New York as the delegation of the Cubans, the Americans had an embargo. No hotel would accept the Cuban delegation. Malcolm X heard about it, and he got a hotel to put Castro up in New York, in Harlem. Sorry. My question, and I promise you, James, I will try and do everything you have asked me to do. That's a promise, Scout's honor. But the question really is, for the theories of the system, for me, it has always been that capitalism goes hand in hand with a parliamentary system. So if we call for such radical change, a left bloc to challenge capitalism, which I understand what you are asking for, calling for, and we must remember there were riots not so long ago in London, okay, 10 years ago, I still remember that. Should this left bloc be for the overthrow of capitalism? I'll put it glibly. Or should it be channeled into parliament? So I think that's an important question, you see, because for all of us, revolution might be a long way away, but it's a system question I'm asking you, James, right? I mean, I haven't read your book, but if in your book, you make a mention about the fact that this system, that, love and marriage, that parliament and capitalism seem to go hand in hand. That's what the theorist tells us. Every system that does not have elections, the Americans want to starve or destroy or whatever. So they argue that parliamentary system, then don't get me wrong, I think the vote was an important thing, the French Revolution, so on and so forth. But they say this is something which we must go hand in hand. So if we call for a left bloc that acts...
Sorry, can I ask you to wrap up, Lawrence? Sorry.
How will it react to parliament?
Thanks, Lawrence. I'm going to bring in David and then take it back to Lindsey and James. So, David.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. Basically, I agree with most of what I've heard. We are dealing with an incompetent government, which is corrupt, and which is opposed by a little party which is hopeless and is not going to act any day soon. I think that the only thing the only way we can work this is to have a policy of no compliance with the Tories at all. With some of the laws they pass, which are designed to keep people down. Not only that, we have to support the strikes and the right to protest whilst we still can, because they're trying to make more laws which will take that right away from us. And that, in my mind, includes supporting groups like XR Rebellion and Insulation Britain, other groups which take active action, because that appears to be the way to go around it, to get around it, because then it's like when the RNC went on strike and made it work. It was great to see. They actually had to respond. If you offer something, you won't get it. You must take it. That's what I think.
Thank you very much, David. Okay, so if I can bring back Lindsey and James, and if you can try and respond to some of those and maybe kind of discuss some of those things amongst yourselves as well, that would be great. So maybe James, do you want to start?
Yeah, great questions, and a lot there. Maybe I'll start with Lawrence's question, as it was so direct, I think. So I have a different starting point, which is I'm interested in sort of speculative and more intellectual debates about methods of change, parliamentary socialism, the relationship between reform, revolution, and insurrection, and all the rest of it. But I don't think, but that's not what I'm most interested in terms of political action, which I think whatever you think the answer is on those theoretical questions, there is the same route for all of them, which is building agency, building power, and building organization. So what I'm primarily interested in, and also the other thing to point out is, regardless of which theory of change you subscribe to, we patently do not have the levels of agency, power, and organization to carry them through. So what I'm most interested in, that's what I'm arguing for in this book, is to extend our power, agency, and organization here and now, to leave open some of these later questions, which I actually don't think can necessarily be prejudged. I think some of them do contend, do depend on contingent things. I mean, let's take the Labour Party, for example. I imagine, many people in this on the Zoom room 10 years ago would have said, oh yeah, the idea that the Labour Party would be the most advanced socialist force in the country for a period of time. Yes, how laughable, how absurd. Oh, Labour would get a socialist through the Labour Party would get to being about 2,700 votes away from being prime minister in a general election. Yeah, how absurd. And I would have probably agreed with you. But contingency matters. Eric Joyce punched a Tory or two in a bar in Westminster, and then a whole series of events happened, which led to the possibility the Labour Party happened to be a vehicle through which all of this anti-austerity popular demand was channeled. So I don't really want to necessarily prejudge those questions. But on the point about channeling, I don't think there's the binary between overthrowing capitalism or channeling something into Parliament. I don't think that's the binary. I mean, firstly, just because we say we want to overthrow capitalism doesn't mean that we are going to overthrow capitalism. We need to build the force to do it, which might mean we need to build the force to win a better deal within, well, in fact, it has to win a better deal within capitalism while we are trying to get beyond it, because we want to get a better deal for workers and their families and communities. And then channeled into Parliament. I mean, there are different ways of using Parliament, and I saw this very painfully up close, and it is absolutely true that parliamentary cretinism is an extremely powerful force, and it can warp the best of us. But I think there are ways in which Parliament can be used that doesn't absorb you totally into it, but where it can be used as a pulpit, where it can be used as a way to raise up issues, and as part of our as part of our sphere of action. It's just, does it become overwhelmingly dominant, and does it conform us into cretinism? And I think that's the thing to watch out for. And the way that you do that is how you have a relationship between the movements that animate our politics and its elected representatives in Parliament, so that they don't walk off and become, another part of the establishment, or get caught up in the parliamentary games.
Thanks, James. Lindsey?
Yeah, I mean, just in response to I think most of the questions were kind of, I would, were just sort of reinforcing, I think, points that one or the other of us had made. So I don't want to respond to them in any depth, except to say that obviously, Ellie's point is important, that people feel very heartened by the thought that there's going to be lots of strikes and that possibly they'll be involved in these strikes. I mean, I'm very excited about the strikes at one level, although I'm not necessarily at another, because I think there's a lot of, there's still a lot of talk about negotiations, and there's a lot of talk about whether they actually, how much of the strikes there will be. And particularly when you look at unison, I think you've always got to be on guard against that kind of thing. But nonetheless, I think they're very, very important developments. And I think the difficulty for us as socialists is that, I think James is absolutely right. If you're talking about moving towards revolution, it doesn't just happen. It's a process, and it's a process which depends on working class organisation getting stronger and getting more confident, as well as the system being in crisis. It's both things going hand in hand, if you like, that you have a system that can no longer operate. And I think after 40 years of neoliberalism, I think we're seeing this very, very dramatically. I haven't talked about the war in Ukraine, but that in itself is a fairly horrific example of this. And of course, its consequences are very, very substantial, not just for the people in Ukraine and Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe, but also for the people who are suffering food shortages in Libya and in all sorts of other places, and fuel shortages. And even in the heart of capitalism, I think Germany is going to have an absolutely huge crisis this year, because it is being forced to accept, you know, the NATO strictures on military spending, and it's also being forced to accept the sanctions on Russia, which are going to give it a huge energy crisis, so, and therefore an economic crisis. So I think there's these big things coming. So you've got the two things that need to go hand in hand, but obviously there is a relationship between the two, that people become stronger by taking action. I mean, that's obviously, I think nobody disagrees about that you actually do these things, and you go on strike, or you go on a demonstration, or you have an occupation, and it actually develops you politically, it develops you in terms of your confidence to do things, and it develops you organizationally. I suppose the question that James has just raised, you know, about Labour and so on, I mean, again, I agree, hands up, I never thought that Jeremy Corbyn would become leader of the Labour Party, and this was given that our office in Stop the War is the same building as his constituency office. We had quite a lot of kind of discussion with all sorts of people, and activity with all sorts of people in making sure this would happen. And I just thought it'll never get to this. It obviously did. It obviously meant that he was the leader, and he did very, very well in the 2017 by-election, a general election. I think there's many reasons why he didn't do, again, I think, as we all know, do as well in 2019. But I think we've got to look at this from a wider perspective as well, because when I said at the beginning about Ben and Corbyn and, you know, that these serious attempts to have a left leadership of Labour end in failure, I think you then have to look at, not at the individuals concerned who, you know, I may have I do have tactical differences with them over things, but it's not to do with the individuals concerned. It's to do with the nature of Labour and Labour's connection to the state, its connection to the establishment, its connection to a parliamentary system, which I would argue is fundamentally rotten. So I suppose that would be a difference. I mean, you know, I don't know how James feels about that, but I do think it's the nature of Labour that prevents it, even when it's got the best people trying to run it, that prevents it from doing that kind of thing.
If I can just come back in there, I mean, I'm sure that a great chunk of your analysis of Labour, I would definitely, I would agree with, and I could provide gory insider detail of how it very much does that. But I don't go as far as you will take it as absolute thing. For this reason, so like jumping off your Germany crisis point, which I think is extremely good. You know, Germany has been has secured, you know, real stability for, you know, of all the countries in the global north, really, since the financial crisis, which is when, you know, the ruling class, consent in the ruling class kind of was withdrawn in lots of populations, and that's why you have all this political volatility. Basically resisted the political volatility. I mean, okay, the AfD went up a bit and then went back down again, but you had Merkel in power for an extremely long time, and then effectively her deputy, just from a different party, but, you know, same difference, near enough, takes over, and they have, you know, they've managed this stability. But it's been based on an economic model which is import cheap energy from Russia, use it to assemble manufactured goods which will be competitive because you get your cheap energy and you hold down wages more effectively, more aggressively than other countries, which they've done for 20 years, and then through the euro basically be subsidized to sell them elsewhere. And when you know, you see this with basically every revolutionary moment or moment where there's really big change. That's why it often comes after a war, is when the ruling class has said, come with, you know, to the population, you know, we're in charge, come with us, and people buy into it, and then it clearly fails. The system is shown to clearly not work. So, you know, why did the Paris Commune happen when it did? Well, it was because France had lost to Prussia, and a large part of that revolt was a kind of patriotic revolt against the ruling class's failure. And so I think what we were have been living in post 2008 was that the ruling class was weak because its hegemony, cracks had appeared across the fresco of its rule, but that wasn't because of us. It wasn't because we were strong and we had forced that to be the case. It was just the system's own failures. And it was in that gap between the moment's possibilities, i.e. the fact that the system is weak, and our movement's strengths, which were not strong enough, that Corbyn's leadership took place. Now, of course, we didn't know what we were doing for some of the time, and there were mistakes and so on. But I think the fundamental part about the failure comes down to that gap and not being able to close that gap fast enough. And I think this goes back to what our task is now, and what should socialists do now? We're going to see, again, as I was calling it, an autumn of action, but whatever. The mask is going to slip further. The system is going to work less, and people's respect for the rulers is going to decrease even more. The thing that we need, though, is we can't just think, well, if they don't support them, they're going to support us. But it's to build our counterpower and our counter hegemony, and then who cares if that takes place through the Labour Party? Fine. If it doesn't take place through the Labour Party, also fine. Who cares? The thing that is important is that we have strong basis of popular power that have the capacity to take this to take the state at some point. I'll shut up because there are lots of questions.
Thanks, James. Is there anything you want to come back on, Lindsey?
No, take some more questions and I'll come back but to respond after that. That'll be fine. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to take the hands I have up. I don't think we'll have time to take more, but I've seen your hand, Pat, so I'll include you in that. But if I could please ask everyone to keep their contributions to a maximum of 2 minutes so we can fit everyone, please. So over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Shabir. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm conscious of the fact James has just said, sort of, who cares, in response to the question I'm about to ask, but nevertheless, I will try and push it, because I was wondering if there's any kind of positive account James could provide us of the possible institutional basis of this left bloc that he's sketched out this evening, and obviously elaborates further in his book. I mean, in terms of the first part, the industrial action, obviously that's going to be the existing trade union movement. But the other two prongs he's talking about, the refusal to pay and possibility of occupation, it's less clear what institutions will take that action. And I think it's important that we do think through what that's actually going to look like, not just as a sort of an ideal, but in practice, who's going to be delivering that change. I mean, within Counterfire, of course, we're very active within the People's Assembly, and perhaps there's scope for the PA to have an active engagement with this, if not actually driving these moments, but bringing together any new movements that emerge within that. I mean, is this perhaps, James, would you see the PA would you sort of lobby for them to move in this direction and be thinking in these terms? Is that the kind of way you see it going? So yeah, maybe it is just a case that it's sketching out what you see as the three likeliest ways in which this opposition will manifest itself. But I wondered if you could give us any more of a positive account of the kind of institutional base you see delivering this.
Thanks, Sam. Pat, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just aware how great this great developments that are taking place offer so many possibilities. And we will carry into this moment, I think, all our different banners and all our different literatures and all our different experiences. But what we need to, I think, just grab a hold of first in order to make that pay off, if you like, is that there are two things. to get the ear of the workers or the citizens, you need to build their movements. We don't know exactly how it's going to pan out, but you have to build their movements, whether they be taking strike action when they do really open their ears and want to know who's going to go next and are very open to solidarity. So we must talk about building those movements. It sounds like an obvious truism, but that has to also mean that we don't intervene immediately on our full program. We have transitional demands, and we should use them. And the second thing, from my long experience in the movement and also in revolutionary activity, is that it is true, and I don't know who said it, but it certainly applies in Britain, that revolutionaries by themselves speak to hundreds or thousands of people, but social democracy still talks to millions. So we have to try and create, out of building this massive movement that we need, to actually formulate what the assemblies might be during this process, how open they must be, how much more dynamic they must be, because the opportunities are much greater just over the last 12 months than probably over the last 40 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. If I can go to Leah next.
Thanks, Shabir. Just a few thoughts running around. I mean, I've been immersed in the Ford report today. I'm about halfway through. This is, I think everyone probably knows what it is. If you don't, I'll explain. But basically, it's at one level, it's a it's a vindication of all the criticisms the left has had of what was done. James may want to comment on it. He's trying to be very even-handed, but actually, when you read a bit deeper, it's, despite there almost certainly being mistakes made by the leader's office, etc., the faction was in action, and they're using anti-Semitism, as we know, from day one. He doesn't make enough of the fact that the Chakrabarti report was. Anyway, the reason that it's relevant is it's a real example that many people who feel very cheated, we've really got this evidence now. So when you think about how do we use it, but above all, how it's going to be spun by the mainstream media. And it's no surprise to us as revolutionaries to see that the mainstream media are not on our side. But what I just feel this need, and I have no idea what it is, so I suppose it's a question beginning of what strategies can we really do to counter the narrative of the mainstream media, but even of the algorithms of social media. And just a couple of very, very, very quick points about what's happening to capitalism and the particularly pernicious version that we have, where in places like France and Germany and Spain, there are some concessions being made, using, capitalism to, like not allow the fuel bills to be as high. And I wonder, and this may not be relevant with the time we've got left, the failure of the move towards capitalism in China and what that's doing to the planet, but also what it's doing, all these empty, almost towns virtually in China, because of there's a global failure to even meet its own anything other than the biggest elite. So it's not a very thought through contribution, but there's some comments and a couple of questions. Thanks, Shabir.
Thanks very much. If I can go to Victor next.
Good evening, comrades. I think we need to make plans for the future. So what are our plans for dealing with the situation that currently opinion polls are suggesting that we are heading for another hard right, war criminal Blairite government? A government that will be led by someone like Keir Starmer, who already is banning periodicals that he doesn't agree with, like RT, already prescribes and bans with his own fake kangaroo courts anybody who doesn't agree with Blairite war criminality, fitting them up as anti-Semites. Even Jewish ladies like the one who just spoken have been fitted up by his kangaroo courts as anti-Semites, and he hasn't even got to power. How are we going to cope with this kind of environment? And how are we also going to cope with the fake leftists who'll be infiltrating us, saying, oh, we've got to keep selling out, compromising, appeasing these Blairites. We've got to work together with Blairite war criminals to get rid of the Tories. We've got to try and crawl further up Mr. Starmer's backside. How are we going to deal with those problems, which are very close to us in the very near future? Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. Larry?
You're muted, Larry.
You should have a button on your screen asking you to unmute. Okay, do you want to put it in the chat? Sorry, I think that's what you're saying. I'll go to John instead, if that's okay.
Yep, I hope you guys can hear me. Yeah, so I've enjoyed this talk. I was wondering about like what the prospects are of moving forward without like a figurehead or a leader. Kind of like, you know, you could say like Greta Thunberg's kind of like a leader, or Martin Luther King, certainly historically, or like Hugo Chavez or Lenin or Corbyn as the opposition. But now we're in a place where we don't really have that token figurehead. And I know that like Mick Lynch has been pretty incredible in filling that void to some degree, at least with some of his television appearances. But how important is that? I don't really know. I don't know if the movement kind of creates them, or if you guys have any thoughts on this subject.
Thanks, John. And Tony.
Thanks, Shabir. Thanks, James and Lindsay. I think it's very important that we remember that Corbyn's election to the leadership of the Labour Party was an absolute freak of an accident. And it isn't going to happen again. And they'll be making sure that it won't happen again. I think Leah was right in terms of the Ford report being a vindication of the whole it's a scam situation and the weaponizing of anti-Semitism. But what the Ford report also demonstrates is that the Labour Party just isn't fit for purpose because it's so factionally split. It's two parties in one party and it can't resolve itself. Of course, we need to work not with the Blairites, and we will need to work with people in the Labour Party who are socialists and agree with us on issues. But even Corbyn himself said at the start of his leadership candidacy, he said, what I want to see at the end of this is a stronger left in this country, a social movement opposed to austerity. He didn't say he wanted a Labour government. He said he wanted a stronger left and a social movement. And those are the things that we need to build and to develop if we're going to actually bring about fundamental change in society. Lindsay's right that people get politicized when they take action and activity. And that's the important thing that we need to encourage people to do. And it changes from moment to moment, from week to week, from month to month, from year to year. At the minute, probably, the last couple of days, people are very exercised about the climate emergency, climate crisis. And we need to get involved with that. And we need to take action if action is being taken with people. And we need to build that movement. A week or two ago, it was about strikes and solidarity with the RMT workers are out on picket lines, and as it will be in coming weeks. And we need to do that. There are times when the NHS is a major crisis and we need to get out on the streets and support the NHS and campaign around things like that. So we need to be aware and we need to be building this movement with activists so that we can actually take action and build that movement across all of those issues as and when the movement comes along, as James saying, it comes along, and we need to be strong enough at the moment to be able to grasp that nettle. And in the meantime, we need to encourage people to join socialist organisations like Counterfire, where we can talk to people and debate with people about the very reasons that we need to develop socialism, and actually the system needs changing, and that the existing institutions aren't the way to do it. We need to look beyond that and be, to other ways of doing things, whilst working with those people in those places that agree with it. So I think it is really vital that we keep that central activity part at the forefront of our minds when we're talking about how we engage people with politics.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thanks everyone. I thought there was some really good contributions and questions. I'm going to bring James and Lindsey back in to respond to those in a second. Just to read out what Larry was trying to say, which is to Lindsey, much as I favour revolution, doesn't the 1917 model need updating? And to James, how does he see revolutionaries relating to the current Labour left? And I just wanted to throw in a couple more dates, which I mentioned the strikes that people should get down to. Also, this Saturday, there is a one crisis, I think it's called, protest, which is assembling at several different places and then converging on Parliament Square. And maybe James can tell us a bit more about that. And also that the People's Assembly have called an anti-Tory conference on the 2nd of October in Birmingham, and there'll be some action around the Tory Party conference there, and a national demonstration on the 5th of November. So some dates for your diaries and things to start thinking about how to build. And yeah, if I can start with you, James, to kind of answer some of those things and to sum up, that would be great.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of very good points and very good questions. What should I do? I'll try to race through some of them. Sam, flesh out left bloc institution. Yeah, okay, so I should probably not talk quite so quickly. My argument is that we want to bring together the left trade unions, the left organisations within the Labour left, like Momentum, social movements like Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Black Lives Matter, Sisters Uncut, Disabled People Against Cuts, CND, People's Assembly, and so on, into alongside the Socialist Campaign Group MPs, the few council leaders or mayors who are on the left, and the left within the Scottish Parliament and within the Welsh Assembly. And that's, thank you, Wendy, I'm going to mention that in a minute. Then, sorry, where was it? Yes. So those are the kind of institutions that I think would come together. And I'm viewing it on sort of overall on three levels. So the first level is, or the top level is strategic coordination between those different groups. So those groups have some kind of shared campaign plan, some grid, some key priorities, and coordinate between themselves. There isn't compunction. It's not like a party. They don't have to have a shared line on things, but there's some kind of shared approach. Then the second level is actions, things that people are doing. For example, Wendy's flagging up this day of action on this Saturday, or strikes, or things that different people are doing, different campaigns which are really live and really current that we want to get people involved in, that we think are the priorities. And then the grassroots and local level is trying to replicate that, but at the local level, so that we're all part of different groups where we live, and so that they are, a tenants union or this or that's the other, so that they're a bit more knitted together, and so that we can act together locally. So that's the kind of basic infrastructure. I have to be honest, I don't go into the detail of how it could be structured or how it could be brought about, because I actually want it to happen. And I think if you begin to say exactly how the thing could happen or you want it to happen, it makes it much less likely that it will. But the basic point is groups aren't losing their autonomy, but they're getting greater coordination. And you just won't hopefully won't get things like people not knowing when, like, you want all the environmental groups to know that what People's Assembly are going to do in 2 months' time, and you want Momentum to know what Black Lives Matter have planned, and you want, and so on and so forth. So that's like very basic outline. On Pat's point about social democracy speaks to millions, and you said formulate what the assemblies might be. I don't know if you mean there in terms of what policy demands we make, or what kind of dual power organizations we create. But either way, I do think yes, we need to start doing that. And the policy bit is extremely easy though, because we already have a whole suite of left social democratic policies that are overwhelmingly popular in the public and are to the left of where Labour were in 2019. So talking about transitional demands and all the rest of it, like it's all there. Yeah, so it's it's all there, and also we have to remember to keep it simple. We're raising up a few strategic popular demands. We're not really laying out a technocratic program for government in case we were ushered through the door tomorrow, because we aren't going to be in any way. There's no such thing as a technocratic pulling of levers within the state anyway. If you're trying to advance a socialist program, it's all going to be about setting up new centers of power and mass mobilization to force things through. Leah, should I just charge through all of them, and or should I break it up and let Lindsey take over for some of it? I don't know what you think. Should I just
go for it, James? Yeah, go on.
Leah, on Ford. Yes, I've also spent most of my day on that matter as well. Just an aside on, we all say a lot of the time, mistakes were made, and of course mistakes were made, but it's also really normal for mistakes to be made. There's in no organization especially facing like the huge volume of work and the massive like stress and levels of attack. So it would be remarkable to have made no mistakes, but I didn't really want to that wasn't my main point to it. You were asked about counter narrative and how do we do a counter narrative? So I think there's one real principle about counter narrative, which we really didn't always get right in the Corbyn leadership, but we really need to think about. Facts don't matter, and direct rebuttal basically doesn't matter. You need to get your direct factual rebuttal on the record somewhere, because it needs to be on the record somewhere. But how people think about an issue, how it's remembered, isn't the facts of it. It's the feeling that it comes out. So like, if you talk to somebody, so, I effectively have a PhD in Labour anti-Semitism, matters. I unfortunately know a very large amount about this, and I wish that I didn't. You talk to somebody and they say, yes, but what about this? And you provide them with all of the facts and they go, yeah, fine. But what about this? And then you provide them with all of the facts. And they go, yeah, but what about this? You provide them with all the facts. Doesn't make any difference, because they have this feeling that there is this thing, and the facts are secondary. So to create a counter narrative, you need to be talking about a different thing, or a thing in a different way. And I think the way in which we can do that now is with movements, and is with doing things in the real world, because we don't have communicative power through the media, but we can make things happen. Like, as Lindsey said, the railway workers don't go to work. There are no trains, right? Then that becomes what the story is and what things are about. When Extinction Rebellion happened, that made that did more to put climate change on people's radars than as many decent speeches as people could make. So I think really we need to, on counter narrative, we need to be thinking about spectacle, about real world actions, and then things which undermine the credibility of our opponents, or integrate their attacks into us. So for example, the media is always going to attack us. Why? Because they're owned by billionaires. That becomes an easy part of your narrative. Then every time that you're attacked, it reinforces your own argument. I mean, I think when we were at our best with Corbyn, that's when we were saying those sorts of things. And you know, when we were at our worst, we were sort of trying to accommodate to those things which would never accommodate us. Victor, plan for Starmer, PM Starmer. Well, I'm going to say we need to bring, I mean, it's not going to be, PM Starmer will, it's the same thing, you know, whatever we are faced with will rely on the strength of our forces. So the same thing we have to do is build up our strength and coordination in all of the places so that we can, resist, provide an alternative where we have to. Larry, how do revolutionaries relate to the Labour left? Probably as they always have. And you know, it's not me to tell people how they should relate to anything else, but also I think, you know, we've had a period when the Labour left was extremely important, right? And the struggle within the Labour Party was extremely important because it was, are we going to keep our most advanced thing in society that we have, which is the leadership of the Labour Party? Are we going to be able to have that? And is it going to have any space to say or do good things? Now that sort of recedes. I think, you know, the Labour left is still important, but it's clearly, you know, that struggle within the party is not the most important thing that is going on. So I think all of these different strands of the left, different movements, different issues, we find our common ground around actions. I don't really think it is around trying to get united political lines on things. I think it's more about things that we can do together. It's much harder to argue when we do things together. It's incredibly easy to get three people in a room who are doing the same thing together, they agree, and then you make them talk about 8 different things and come up with a joint statement, and then you'll get 3 different factions walking out of the room. And I think we're much stronger if we're able to pull things together. I think it's totally possible. I mean, so I've been doing this work that Wendy Patterson put in the chat about we all want to just stop oil, this coalition between Jeremy Corbyn's Peace and Justice Project and Just Stop Oil and some trade unionists and so on. You know, a few years ago, some trade unions and Just Stop Oil, there's no way that they'd even be talking to each other, let alone anything else. But Just Stop Oil went out and made solidarity statements to unite oil workers in their pay dispute, because they were saying, yeah, we don't want oil, but it's not the workers whose fault it is. And I think, you can see people from very different political backgrounds coming together because, the crisis we face is so large. John made a very interesting point about leadership, and my view on this is somewhat changed over the years. I think leadership is extremely important. And we aren't going to have individual leadership for a bit, and then one will be thrown up, or a group of people will be thrown up, and that's just what happens. But I think how we can have a sort of cipher for leadership, and I think it will be quite healthy for a bit as we readjust to not looking to Jeremy for everything, which I think became a bit of a crutch for many people. Totally understandably, and that's not a criticism of people or of Jeremy, of course. But I think different movements or different actions will come to the fore and will take up the position of leadership for periods of time, and will help move us forward. Like Mick Lynch was in effect the leader of the left and the working class for a week, and he did a brilliant job. And other people, other people who will be at different points the tip of the spear will do that. And then in terms of organisation, I hope that some kind of more collaborative and collective approach through a left bloc will help give some of the kind of second order things you get from leadership, which are to do with coordination, authority and coherence. And the final thing, so then I can finish and you never have to hear me go on for ages again, which is, I think Tony said, about forward, like the Labour Party is fundamentally split into. Yeah, it is. Of course, the Labour Party is fundamentally split into. I write that sentence almost exactly the same in my book, and it always has been. But the Labour Party is made up. It's got one part which is in the more radical end of the Labour movement, and in the grassroots, people that want to transform the system. And it's got one foot in the state and the nicer end of the establishment, that wants to prop up the system in return for a few mild reforms. And that has always been the conflict at the heart of the Labour Party. And of course, that was what we had. That is what Ford shows, I think, extremely clearly. And that's what Jeremy's response to it basically says, if you take a look at it. And of course, the right are trying to make sure that the left can never lead the party again. Of course they are. But then the question is, what can you do about it? And we have an electoral system where a minor party will not become the main receptacle for anti-Tory votes unless it has enormous social weight, and therefore can replace Labour in one or at maximum 2 electoral cycles. And that's not the case. So if we're talking about building power, we should see, where do we have power? We have a bit of power in the Labour Party, right? We've got some MPs, we have members, we have some socialists, we've got some things, we've got affiliated trade unions. We also have power in other places. Let's build them up, let's knit them together, and then let's see what happens. Because, possibly that, yes, might those 2 parties in one day become 2 parties? It's entirely possible. Might one win out over the other one entirely? That's also possible. We don't know. We can't know what the future will hold. And we don't know in this we don't know how the system is going to break down politically, economically, ecologically, it's socially, and so on. But we do know that there are going to be threats and opportunities for us. And that, I'll say it again, my argument is very, very simple. The stronger progressive social forces are, the stronger they are, each are individually, the more united, coordinated, and connected they are, will give us the greatest chance to win, whatever winning might look like, in these contingent openings as they come. So I'll end on that.
Thanks very much, James. That was very comprehensive. Over to you, Lindsey.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for contributing, particularly James, but everybody, because I think this is a really interesting discussion, and there's so much that needs to be talked about. We've touched on a whole number of things, but there's the whole kind of legacy of Corbynism, what it means, and some of Leah's talked about and James has talked about, and so on. But there's also much wider questions and much older questions about what kind of tradition is the most effective in terms of organizing socialists. I mean, I just want to make a few points, because again, there's lots of points that I agree with or that have been covered, so I won't. But I'd just say, firstly, about the movements that we've all talked about, and I think everybody's agreed we're entering this period where there are far more movements, far more awareness over a whole number of things, and far more likely to be successful. I mean, I'm not saying that every one of them is going to be successful or fully successful, but there's definitely a sense that people are looking for quite fundamental change in society in quite large numbers in large parts of the world. I mean, Sri Lanka was perhaps the most obvious example recently, but you could look at a whole number of electoral results in Latin America in recent months, which have returned left politicians and so on. You can look at what happened with Mélenchon in France. It looks to me in Germany there are going to be quite a lot of strikes that they're talking about. So all of these things are very encouraging. And I just want to echo, I think it was a point that Pat made or somebody made, which is that we don't know what these are going to look like. We all come into them with our own politics and history and priorities of what we think are important and all these sort of things. But the truth is that there's no blueprint for any of these movements or how they're developed. I mean, this is even true if you think of the trade unions. And we look at the trade unions as particularly sort of fixed formation now, because in this country they're very old and have a very, very long history. But the truth is there's also new trade unions breaking out. There's the Uber strikes and so on that are going on. There's a whole range of things that we just don't know what exactly they're going to look like. And the first thing that socialists should do is to support those movements, all movements which are will progress society forward, and to do everything they can in solidarity with those movements. The second thing I think it's worth saying, though, is when we look at the history of socialism, and James referred to the Paris Commune, but there's lots and lots of examples you could use. You think about socialist theory, and nearly all of it comes out of real movement, struggle, wars, revolutions, whatever it is, you know, that and this is where people, you know, socialists don't just sit down and think, oh, let's develop some theory about whether you need to smash the state, or, you know, how a revolution progresses, or any of these sorts of things. People write this theory out of their own experience of having seen particular movements and of mass movements of people moving forward. And I think it's very important for us that we have to learn from the struggle. We're not just, you know, we've got our own ideas, and we've got lots of ideas, and I think which actually can be useful to people in struggle. But at the same time, you learn with every new struggle, it always surprises you, and it always surprises you exactly who does it, what time they do it, what the importance of it is, and all those other sorts of things. And so I just wanted to throw that in, because I think we have to look at history, and we have to look at theory as the condensation of working class experience, because that's really what it is. And the point that Pat did make, which was that social democracy is much more powerful than small revolutionary groups, is undoubtedly true. And it remains so. I don't take the view that Starmer can't get elected. I don't take the view that people can't return to Labour in some numbers, given, you know, we're facing Liz Truss for Prime Minister and so on. It seems to me that might be quite a choice that many people will make. So I don't think we should doubt the importance of Labour or its resilience as an organisation for 122 years. And that's something that we have to take into account. The other hand, however, we also have to take into account that Labour hasn't succeeded, even with left leadership, or even with the attempt at left leadership, in achieving what it wanted to do. And I don't put this down to individual mistakes. I agree with James. Anybody who engages in struggle, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. It's absolutely inevitable. As soon as you start doing, I mean, the only people who don't make mistakes are people who don't do anything, which is absolutely worthless. So you do need people to be able to say, look, I got this wrong. I got this tactical call wrong. I decided this was the most important issue, and it wasn't. I thought this was the time that we could do such and such, and we weren't able to do it. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But what I'm talking about with Labour is something more fundamental than that, which is the structure of Labour, the nature of Labour, the fact that it is this amalgam of a left, which is essentially its grassroots, and the MPs and at least historically, perhaps not so much now, although there's a fair amount of it now, the trade union bureaucracy as well, does lead it in a certain direction. And one of the things they feared most from Corbyn was and this is why they went so crazy about foreign policy and laying a wreath at the cenotaph and all these sorts of things, because they don't want anybody who will seriously challenge the priorities of the British state and everything that means. So I think we have to look at it seriously. And somebody asked, is the model of 1917, does it need updating? Well, no doubt. I mean, this was something that happened, however long ago it was, more than 100 years ago. So of course, we're not talking about, history is never a kind of action replay of what happened at some point in the future. Nonetheless, what was that revolution about? And most other revolutions, they find their own sources of power, which are not in the established parliamentary system. This was true in Portugal in 1975. It was true in Iran in 1979. It's true in lots of examples where people begin to look to grassroots organisation based on their own power. And I think that's what we have to think about. Now, we're a long way from all of those. So I'll just say, in terms of that, I think it's so important that we do all work together. I think it's absolutely vital. And I think we have to be very, very critical of people who just want to raise differences all the time, rather than raising what we have in common and what unites us. And therefore, if you want to fight against climate change, you want to support the strikes, the crucial question is, do you agree on this issue? And are there other things that you don't agree on? But there's also the question, okay, if you do agree on those issues, how do we then take the movement forward? And those are important debates, and they are debates that we have to have. So, you know, I'm very happy that we are part of movements like the People's Assembly, and that we do take part in all these movements. We're part of the trade union movement. But also, I believe as a socialist, you do need socialist organisation. Just one final point I wanted to make is that about leaders. I mean, I agree, leaders get thrown up by the struggle and by all sorts of different things. But I'd also say something else which I think is important. I think all of us have to be leaders in our own area, in our own field, in our own locality, in our own workplace. We've got to be able to be the people who stand up and be counted over these things, whether it's campaigning against racism, whether it's supporting a pay claim, whether it's doing any of those things. And I think in that sense, one of the things about the organised left is we have to see ourselves much more as being able to project being part of a leadership in the genuine sense, not of being somebody who's famous or who's a government minister or any of those sorts of things, but that if you are leading in your own community, if you're leading in the school where you work, if you're leading in any of those things, then that's actually incredibly important in terms of what you do. So I'll leave it at that. I hope people who agreed with some of what I said will think about joining Counterfire if you're not a member, but I know many of you will also be thinking along other lines. I'd like to thank James very much for taking part, and I look forward to reading the book and to having further discussions, because we're going into a very interesting time politically, and it's going to be very challenging, but I hope also something where the whole of the left can grow.